Well, this week we're picking up where we left off with the test creek.
Oh, the test creek.
Yeah, everybody should do a test creek from time to time, but we did this little 18 by 18 inch test creek to test ideas for the 3 and maybe now 4, I'm so happy with these creeks, on the logging railroad.
He's been shoveling snow.
We've been shoveling snow, and I'm really looking forward to doing something that doesn't look like winter. So this is the test bed that we did for the creeks on the logging railroad, particularly Bottleneck Creek.
Yes.
Which is the first one we're doing. And this is the actual Bottleneck Creek in question.
Yes.
And this is kind of the finished version right here. We're starting with the finished version, and then we're going to wind the clock back to the beginning and show how we arrived at this point. The goal, of course, was to create a wild-looking creek, something that you would find up in the mountains.
Especially with the snow runoff.
This is how it started out. So this is just the insulation foam carved with a Sureform tool, and then the cast, they're urethane castings, urethane foam castings for rocks, and then the creek bed itself just carved out with this raspy tool, a Sureform tool. This is, of course, exactly how we did the test creek.
Right.
And why we did it this way. This is the bridge over Bottleneck Creek. And this is the real name of the bottleneck. It's a bottleneck in laying track. It's also a bottleneck in the rock work here. But I can't set this bridge permanently in place until the scenery underneath it is done, or I won't be able to get to that area. So normally I wouldn't do it this way. But the bridge is made out of logs.
Yes.
And regular ties. There's not a lot of regular ties on the logging railroad, but this is in the middle of a switch right here. So it's kind of a hybrid. It's logs below and regular railroad ties above.
Right.
So anyway, let's start building the creek. Now the first thing is we used acetone.
It looks like Kool-Aid, but
but it's acetone. We've used acetone to etch the actual creek bed on the test section to create cut banks and that sort of thing. Up here at the top, I'm not concerned because we'll come back and do this after the track is all laid, because this is all your cattails.
yes.
This is kind of a little swampy area up here. It's typical of what you find on a lot of railroads, that where they've put the grade in, it's trapped water alongside the grade, and it's created these little swamps. And so there's a fairly extensive swamp that extends over both sides of Bottleneck Creek. And we'll come back after the track is laid and the rest of the scenery is in, because this is all going to be very fragile.
Yes.
But we can get to it,
Right.
where we can't get to the area underneath the bridge. And so here again, we've got to finish all this area under the bridge before I can set the bridge and actually lay the track.
Right.
So the next step, just as on the test bed, is to put down a primer, and we're using this golden textured acrylic primer, and then mixing that with acrylic paint to the artist's acrylics to get the right texture.
Oh boy, that does look like the right texture, all right.
Well, it doesn't, you can't really, but it's got a sandy quality, and boy does it stick, because that acrylic primer is kind of like glue. And I want it to stick to this rock, because you can see there's a lot of seams where I've had to splice together a lot of different castings to make the rock look the way it's supposed to look. Plus, some of the rock over here is carved into the insulation foam and doesn't even look like rock. So all this stuff needs to be brought around to the same color, which isn't pink or purple.
Maybe Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah. So, and you can see I really thinned it with a lot of water, because it really needs to get down into the cracks, but I don't really care if it doesn't cover super well, because that gives a lot of modeling to the surface, which I like.
Well, and the cracks could be natural.
Well, I think that gives a much more natural appearance to put it on thin and let it suck down into the cracks, leaving a little, especially on the cast urethane, leaving a lot of the underlying color actually coming through. But right here you can see where part of the rock work is cast and part of the rock work is carved. Once it's all brought around to the same color and texture, it's pretty hard to tell where the casting leaves off and the carved section begins. But this really brings the castings to life.
Wow.
And just getting rid of the seams and all the blue glue and everything is working wonders for the appearance of this whole thing. So there are several of these big cracks
Yes.
in the cliff face, and material from above is going to wash down through these cracks. And one of them might even become something of a fourth creek.
Oh.
Who can say?
Right.
Anyway, we're ready now to actually put the creek bed in over here at Bottleneck Creek. You can see I didn't put primer underneath here. The next thing that needs to happen is I need to peel away all of that crunchy plastic material.
What a job.
But doesn't that look nice? That just really brought the texture around.
It did.
And speaking of textures, the next thing up is Celluclay.
That actually looks good.
Doesn't it? We've used Celluclay and Sculptamold on the test section, and because this is mostly sort of mud, the Celluclay does better mud.
Yes.
The Sculptamold does better rock. But I needed to blend this into the fascia board, and I wanted a really kind of loose, muddy texture. There'll be other materials brought down on top of it. But the number one goal here below the cliffs was to tie the cliffs into the fascia board and to create this nice kind of muddy texture where material from above has fallen down, and then there'll be sagebrush and stuff like that. But mostly right now we're looking for the muddy creek bottom below the river rocks, something to stick the river rocks into. Oh, and then we did this.
This reminds me of Echo Canyon.
This is an homage to the stick that holds up the 1,000-foot high cliff in Echo Canyon, Utah. Years ago, back in the 50s, some kids put a stick under the rock to hold up the whole cliff, and it's been legend.
Yes.
On to the creek bed. These are the river rocks that will be shoved into the creek bed, same thing we used on the test section. We've got the small rocks from a landscaping product, the large round rocks from the craft aisle at Walmart, and some jagged rocks from the garden.
Yes.
Because why not?
Exactly.
And now just figuring out where everything should be, a nice creative process, where there should be small rocks, where there should be big rocks. And then there's going to be the same fallen tree.
Yes.
And it'll be lodged here in the bottleneck. So I wanted to figure out the position of that and then actually create a saddle in the Celluclay, and then I went out and dug up another weed.
That looks good.
And trimmed it off and glued it to the log. And that looks really nice. I think this looks better than the test fallen tree.
Yes. It
because
looks
it's
really
bigger
real.
roots.
It looks really real.
And I left more dirt in place, and this will all have to be secured with white glue or it'll all just fall away. But I like a lot more dirt being left in the roots. And boy, I think that looks neat.
Yeah, it looks really
I've
good.
also added some more vegetation out of the Christmas cinnamon broom,
Yes.
because that worked really
Those
well,
work.
too.
Yeah, don't throw those away.
Yeah, who'd have thought that it would make good scenery on your railroad at the end of Christmas? Now, I doused the whole area down with wet water, which, of course, is water with a dash of soap, and then added some white glue in to start securing everything in place up here. Makes kind of a sloppy mess of everything, but once it dries out, all of this white glue should disappear. And this should secure all of the rocks into place. And one of the big concerns was the dirt here on the roots. And sure enough, this dried hard as a rock, and that dirt's not going anywhere. And once it all dried out, this just looks spectacular.
It looks authentic.
I had to set the shea in place just to get a sense of the scale.
It's really hard to keep track of this scale when you just see a picture of it, but the shea helps to make that in proportion.
Yeah, this could be N scale to large scale.
Right.
That's one thing about scenery. It's kind of independent of scale. I was now ready to pour the deep pour water. There's not a lot of water under here.
Right.
So I just kind of mixed up a very small batch. It turns out to be harder to mix small batches of the deep pour water.
Oh, dear.
Because it's hard to get the proportions right.
Right.
Anyway, I'm now ready to put my creosote onto my actual railroad ties.
There you go.
Watco Danish wood oil is what I use for creosote. And I'm not staining many of the ties, but where the railroad has chosen to use real live, honest-to-goodness railroad ties, because of the switch, and this is the lead into the engine shop, I figured they would have used real railroad ties here and actual creosote.
Boy, I can smell it, literally.
And then just distress the heck out of it, because I don't want anything up here to have a very fresh feel to it.
No.
So I took a saw blade and just went after these things, paying special attention to checking the heck out of the ends of the ties.
Yes.
Because I really want this to look used. The bottom side of the bridge, however, I wanted it to look like there was spilled creosote.
Oh, there you go.
And I thought that turned out quite nice. No one will ever see this.
No, but they
Because
might.
it's underneath the bridge, and unless somebody can shrink themselves down and crawl under there, they're never going to see this detail. But that doesn't mean you can't have fun doing it.
That's right. We know it's there.
Well, the goal here is to have fun building this stuff, after all.
Exactly.
So there's the distressed ties, and then I decided to throw some soot from an actual steam locomotive. We've got all that soot from Evanston, and that helps distress the area and make a big mess too. And then I set some rusty rail in place just to visually see what that's going to look like. I think that looks great.
Looks wonderful.
I'm thrilled. Oh, also, I made all those distressed ties. I was sitting there one day listening to the radio, and I thought, let's make some distressed ties. And I thought, one of those looked good under the bridge.
Yes.
So it got caught in the log jam. So now we need a very small batch of Celluclay, because I'm going to use this to set the bridge in place. It'll be stuck down into this mud, and I don't want this mud to get down into my deep pour water or details down here and make a big mess out of it. So I just set this piece of sandpaper in place.
Well, that's a good idea.
And then I squished a bunch of Celluclay in around it, and the sandpaper is protecting the stuff below, and it's still perfectly functional as sandpaper.
Oh, that's wonderful. Double-sided now.
Double-sided, yeah. So anyway, now I'm ready to shove my log bridge down into the Celluclay and get it positioned just right. And now I'm going to add also some white glue, some more dilute white glue. I think the Celluclay would probably hold that in place for time and all eternity, but I want to make sure it's really well anchored in place. So while the Celluclay was still wet and a bit gooey, I also added a little bit of dilute white glue along where the logs are stuck into the Celluclay and made sure the bridge was positioned exactly level and true to the other ties, ready to receive rail. And there's the finished look right there.
That looks really real.
But you can see why we needed to detail under the bridge first. I love the view down through the ties here.
That's really interesting, yes.
This is something that if you peer down through there, but the view down through the ties on the bridge is just spectacular. And there it is, the finished creek.
Yes.
The finished Bottleneck Creek. Well, it'll have more water at the bottom. I just poured water under the bridge because that's the detail. That's the place that needed work. And now, before I can lay rail, I have to figure out how the two sections of railroad are going to join together.
Oh, dear.
And I've been worried about how to pull this into alignment and everything, but the rails will have a seam right here, and then I placed rail joiners. I cut these rail joiners down, and I cut the ties down so that the joiners can slide easily back and forth. Because in order to move the modules up onto the brackets and then back down here if they need work, then that seam has to be opened and closed and opened and closed. So those joiners slide easily.
Oh, good.
And that makes it possible to just remove them. Now I'm ready to put in the spikes, but because we've used real wood and ties and pencils and all kinds of different things, all the holes have to be pre-drilled.
Which is easier on the wrist.
It's a lot easier putting the spikes in. I also broke about 10 bits.
Yes.
Because that's the nature of it. But using the Dremel tool.
Yes.
And those really small bits came in here and pre-drilled all of the holes for all of the spikes. Because a lot of these ties are really, really hard wood. And then, of course, it's fun to just set a wheel truck in place and roll it around.
Make sure it goes.
Make sure it goes. And now, because there is a switch on top of the Bottleneck Creek Bridge, now I'm ready to actually construct the switch up here. And we've got a whole video on how to hand lay ties. But the first thing I did is I set the frog. I just loosely put the stock rails in place so I'd know where the frog is going to go, because everything builds off of the frog.
Okay.
And so set the frog and then figured out where the points are going to go, and that would allow me to cut out the rest of the rail and spike all of the rail in place. Being very, very careful to hold it engaged. And even though I didn't need to pre-drill the cedar ties, I did, because I didn't really want to push down hard on this bridge.
That wouldn't be a good idea at all.
Because I might break it. So everything, even the cedar ties, all got pre-drilled for spikes. Now I'm using rail joiners on everything up here, even though they don't look very good. But they're fairly easy to disguise.
Oh, good.
And we'll come back later on and sort of disguise the fact. I thought about soldering all of these rail joints up here, but I sort of like the idea of rail joiners because sometimes things need to move a tiny bit. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm ready to set the crossbar now. I've got the points in place, and I'm using a circuit board crossbar, and I'm also using a Logos Creek ground throw.
Oh, that's really cool.
Well, this thing's 7 feet up in the air, and I want to be able to manually throw it, so I want something indestructible. I bolted the points together with 0.90s, and I'm going to do some more work on that. But I like how it turned out. It's not painted or anything just yet, but now I was ready to lay the rest of my rail off of the switch over toward the engine shop, and so on. Now all of this is going to go up on these shelf brackets, clear up here in the air, and then the brackets themselves will hold everything in registration so it doesn't move around.
Yes.
But look what's in the way.
That's always bugged me.
That's been here in the shop since 1975. It doesn't work very well, and there it is right hovering above the logging railroad, so time for it to go away.
Yes.
Anyway, we'll pick that up next week. We'll also look at what you've been working on.
Yes, very tiny stuff.
Very tiny. I'm working large scale. You're working incredibly, incredibly small scales.
Yes, this is closer to what you're working
This is
at,
1/32 scale, so that's much closer, but you've been working on this really neat coffee shop.
Yes.
So we're going to come back and look at your finished coffee shop, because you just wrapped that up.
Yes, just barely.
And also, since we're out of rail.
Yeah.
And I had to stop laying tracks, so I thought, well, it's time to build the engine shop.
Yes.
So that'll be an upcoming show as well. Anyway, there's Bottleneck Creek.
There it is.
So I know you want to follow along with all of this work, and you can do that by going to the channel and becoming a subscriber by clicking the blue button right there. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here on Tuesday because we're looking at some collectible stuff.
Oh, boy.
See ya.
See ya.